Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. One of the great things about being a climate scientist at NASA or NOAA is that you get to rewrite the past over and over again. So you don't like the fact that the Red Sox and the Patriots beat Los Angeles teams in the last championships? Well, you just change the results. In this video, I'm going to show you what NASA and NOAA have done to Iceland's history. This was the 2011 NASA unadjusted temperature graph for Reykjavik, Iceland. You can see that the warmest time in Iceland was around 1940, and then it cooled dramatically until about 1979, which not coincidentally is when climate alarmists always start their Arctic graphs. Alarmists want to show that the Arctic is heating up and melting, so they start their graphs right at the coldest year, and they ignore all the warmer years prior to that. And you see exactly the same pattern in Tasselak, Greenland, which I discussed in my previous video. Warmest years were around 1940, dramatic cooling to about 1980, and then warming back up again. And this was reported by scientists at the time. Dr. Hans Alman said, temperatures in the Arctic have increased 10 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900, an enormous rise from a scientific standpoint. And you can see it right there in the temperature graph, more than 4°C warming from 1900 to about 1940. Here's another story from 1952 from the leading American Arctic expert, Dr. William Carlson. February 18, 1952, polar ice thaw increasing. Dr. William S. Carlson, an Arctic expert, said tonight that the polar ice caps were melting at an astonishing and unexplained rate and were threatening to swamp seaports by raising the ocean levels. The glaciers of Norway and Alaska are only half the size they were 50 years ago. So all evidence is that the Arctic was very warm around 1940 and that glaciers were melting very rapidly. And the NASA graphs for Iceland and Greenland show a tremendous amount of cooling from 1940 till about 1980. In 1961, the New York Times reported that there was unanimous consensus among scientists that Earth was cooling. And by the mid-1970s, we were in a full-blown ice age scare. This was the front page of the Chicago Tribune on March 2, 1975. It's getting colder, brr, new ice age on way soon. In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snow cap has expanded 12%, and for the first time in this century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. Many climatologists see these signs as evidence that a significant shift in climate is taking place, a shift that could be the forerunner of an ice age like that which gripped much of the northern hemisphere before retreating 10,000 years ago. So the Chicago Tribune confirmed that temperatures in Iceland in the late 1970s were the coldest time in the past century. But this graph destroyed global warming theory because carbon dioxide levels are very low around 1940, yet the Arctic was very warm. And the Arctic is the air conditioner for the northern hemisphere. If the Arctic is cold, the northern hemisphere is going to be cold too. And this was confirmed in the 1974 temperature graph from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which showed that for the whole planet it was very warm in 1940 and there was a tremendous cooling after that. And the headline was, Global Climate Believed Returning to a Harsher and Colder State. Droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes have plagued much of the nation and the world in recent years. Most people consider these weather conditions to be abnormal and temporary, but instead climatologists now believe that the first half of the 20th century was blessed with unusually mild weather, and that the global climate has begun returning to a harsher but more normal state. For the long run, there is mounting evidence of a worldwide cooling trend. So all of these bad things, droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, were blamed on global cooling. The same things which they now blame on global warming. Reality is a smoking gun against global warming alarmism, so climate scientists decided to do something about it. They decided to get rid of the 1940s warmth. This ClimateGate email from 2009 was between two of the big players in climate science, Tom Wigley of NCAR and Phil Jones of the Climatic Research Unit in England. Here are some speculations on correcting sea surface temperatures to partly explain the 1940s warming blip. If you look at the attached plot, you'll see the land also shows the 1940s blip, as I'm sure you know. So if we could reduce the ocean blip by, say, 0.15 degrees Celsius, then this would be significant for the global mean, but we'd still have to explain the land blip. It would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we're still left with why the blip. So these climate scientists had made up their mind to get rid of the 1940s warmth, but they didn't even have an explanation for why they were going to do it. And that's exactly what they did. This was the 2011 adjusted data for Reykjavik, Iceland. That huge 1940s warmth had completely disappeared. This is a 2012 version of the same plot, and in that one they put a little bit of the warmth back. Not all of it, but a little bit of it. A few years later they had removed the warmth again though. The yellow shows the unadjusted temperatures, and the black shows the adjusted temperatures. This data tampering prompted a complaint in a letter from Senator Malcolm Roberts to NASA, and after they received the letter, they put the warmth back, for a little while. But then by June 2018 they had removed the warmth from the 1940s again. But now, under heavy criticism, they've put the warmth of the 1940s back in Iceland. So now NASA has restored the 1940s warmth at Reykjavik, but they did something else. The blue line is the unadjusted data from 2011, and the yellow line is the unadjusted data from 2019. For some reason, the unadjusted data is warmer now than it was back in 2011. It's amazing how these people can just rewrite history at will. What this little bit of data tampering in recent years does for them is it makes it look like the present is warmer than the 1940s, even though we know that isn't true. And it's not just at Reykjavik where the 1940s warmth was removed. Other stations in Iceland show exactly the same thing. So here's where the soap opera gets very interesting. When Gavin Schmidt at NASA was confronted by Senator Malcolm Roberts of Australia about this data tampering, Schmidt responded with a very snide letter saying, "It's not my data, blame NOAA." Schmidt said, "You appear to hold a number of misconceptions, which I'm happy to clarify at this time. Firstly, in the graphs, you show the data is quite clearly and correctly labeled as originating from GHCN. For your information, GHCN stands for Global Historical Climatology Network and is a project of the NOAA National Center for Environmental Information, NCEI. Here's one of the tampered graphs which Senator Roberts was referring to. It says up here NASA, but down at the bottom it says GHCN. So it has both NASA and NOAA's fingerprints on it. NASA didn't want to take responsibility for the data tampering, but there's a huge problem with this. And here's the problem. This graph is from one of NASA's global warming propaganda pages. The graph purports to show that all these supposedly independent data sets are coming up with the same results for global temperature. But when Senator Roberts confronted Gavin Schmidt at NASA about obvious fraud in the data tampering, Schmidt said, "It's not my data, it's from NOAA." So there's nothing independent about this data. NASA and NOAA data are essentially the same thing, and they're heavily tampered to produce the results they want to see. And note that the 1940s warmth has been almost completely removed, just as they discussed in the ClimateGate email. Remember that in the 1940s the Arctic was rapidly melting, glaciers were disappearing, and scientists were warning of flooding from massive sea level rise. But by the mid-1970s they were talking about global cooling, a new ice age, and Iceland ports being blocked up for the first time in the century. Yet the temperature is exactly the same in these graphs. These are completely fraudulent. I'll be talking a lot more about this in an upcoming video. The reason that these climate scientists can get away with such obvious fraud is that everybody's afraid to question them. The press is afraid to question them. Politicians are afraid to question them. They know that they can do anything with impunity. Their rewriting of history would be the equivalent of the sports world of making the Dodgers the World Series champions and the Rams the Super Bowl champions. No one would put up with this kind of fraud in the relatively unimportant sports world, but for some reason people are too afraid to speak up in the world of climate, which threatens our entire energy and political future. This fraud needs to be stopped. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.